Welcome to this explainer. Have you ever walked down a grocery store aisle, marveling at the perfectly uniform produce, and wondered exactly how it all got there? Today, we're setting the stage for a deep dive into the complex and often entirely invisible corporate structures that dictate how our grocery store shelves are actually stocked. We're going to look at the massive shift toward the corporatization of agriculture, unpacking both the incredible efficiencies it brings and the profound challenges it creates for the folks actually growing our food. It's funny, right? It's a question we rarely ask ourselves when we're tossing an apple or a bag of rice into our cart. Who really controls the food we grow? We kind of picture this traditional, independent farmer making day-to-day decisions on their own land. But the modern reality is experiencing an immense shift. Today, traditional, independent farming is rapidly being replaced by highly structured, modern agribusiness supply chains. And to understand how this works, we really have to look at the primary engine driving this whole change. And that engine is contract farming. Basically, it's a formal agreement between farmers and corporate buyers, think food processing companies or massive retail chains, for the cultivation and supply of agricultural produce under predetermined conditions. The main thing you should take away from this is that it isn't just a simple buyer-seller handshake at harvest time. No way. This agreement dictates everything from the specific crop variety to the exact delivery schedules, long before a single seed is even planted in the ground. So here is our roadmap for this explainer. 1. What is contract farming? 2. The promise of the contract. 3. The corporate power imbalance. 4. Ecological and economic risks. And 5. Safeguards for a fair future. Okay, let's dive into this. Section 1. What is contract farming? The mechanics of the deal. A typical contract farming arrangement involves 3 interconnected stages. Think of it like a giant puzzle. Step 1 is input supply. The contracting company hands over the blueprints and materials, stuff like certified seeds, fertilizers, and modern technical expertise. Step 2 is production. This is where the farmer steps in. Actually, it's more like the farmer is the builder here, providing the land, the physical labor, and the day-to-day management to execute those strict corporate protocols. And finally, step 3 is procurement. Upon harvest, the company buys the produce according to predetermined quality specs and prices. So, modern corporations provide the advanced tools while farmers execute the physical labor under a highly structured set of guidelines. Let's move on to Section 2, the promise of the contract, the theoretical benefits. Now, put yourself in the shoes of a smallholder farmer for a second. Contract farming suddenly gives you a guaranteed buyer and completely shields you from volatile market swings with locked-in, predetermined prices. It's like upgrading from gambling at the open market to having a stable salary. Plus, you get access to cutting-edge technology and scientific methods that would otherwise be entirely unaffordable. The quality standards naturally rise, and these contracts can even act as collateral for easier access to bank credit. I mean, on paper, it sounds like an absolute win-win scenario, right? But now, what's really interesting about this slide is the contrast. The theoretical benefit of contract farming is risk sharing, a mutual partnership where both sides support each other. But the practical reality on the ground, it often turns into risk shifting. Because of deep structural inequalities, the risks don't actually disappear. They just get shifted away from the massive corporation and placed squarely onto the shoulders of the individual farmer. Let's explore exactly how that happened. That brings us to Section 3, the corporate power imbalance. David versus Goliath in agriculture. One of the most significant casualties in this whole system is the absolute loss of farmer autonomy. The corporation essentially becomes the puppet master. They don't just pick the crop. They dictate the exact seed varieties, they mandate the minute-by-minute chemical application schedules, and they even choose the irrigation timing and harvest dates. Centuries of traditional indigenous knowledge, it's rapidly being replaced by a total dependence on proprietary corporate technologies. This quote from the source material really hits the nail on the head. Farmers increasingly become implementers of corporate production plans. It's a pretty powerful and sobering thought. While the farmers still legally own their land and carry all the physical burden of working it, they effectively lose substantial control over how that land is actually cultivated. They transform from independent agricultural entrepreneurs into basically managers of a corporate blueprint. And this loss of autonomy is compounded by a critical economic concept called a monopsony. Now, a monopsony is a market condition where numerous sellers, in this case the farmers, depend on a single dominant buyer, the corporation. When one agribusiness becomes the primary purchaser in a region, local wholesale markets weaken, and independent traders just pack up and exit. This leaves the farmers totally economically dependent on a single corporation. And honestly, when you only have one possible buyer for your specialized crop, you have absolutely zero negotiating leverage during contract renewals. Let's ground this abstract economics in a very tangible and often devastating reality. Because the purchasing company usually conducts the quality assessment itself, things can get highly subjective. Say there's a market surplus and open market prices fall. Companies might arbitrarily reject produce for what they call minor cosmetic defects, a slight variation in color or size or appearance. Because these are highly specialized contract crops, that rejected produce has little to no market value anywhere else. The company walks away, and the farmer is left with a worthless harvest and a massive mountain of production costs.
Moving to Section 4, Ecological and Economic Risks, the long-term costs of efficiency.
So corporate procurement demands massive efficiency, right? Well, that usually means monoculture, planting giant areas with a single genetically similar crop. This absolutely destroys biodiversity and drastically increases vulnerability to pests and climate shocks. It also requires intensive chemical usage, like heavy fertilizers and pesticides, which directly leads to soil degradation, water pollution, and severe groundwater depletion. And here is the harshest truth of the whole shebang. If the local soil or water is entirely depleted, multinational corporations can simply pack up and relocate. The farmers, however, are permanently stuck with that barren, degraded land. This dynamic leads directly into a terrifying debt trap. Just look at how the risk is distributed here. The company absorbs the final product marketing risks, like the fluctuations in the retail market. But the farmer? They absorb the cultivation risks. If a drought, a flood, or a pest outbreak ruins the crop, the farmer loses their income, for sure. But they are still entirely responsible for the input loans, the labor costs, and the irrigation investments. They are left holding the bag for the debt, which creates long-term financial vulnerability. Let's look at the solutions in Section 5, Safeguards for a Fair Future, balancing efficiency with equity. So the crucial point is that contract farming is not inherently exploitative. It's a market institution, and its outcomes depend on the rules of the game. To fix these systemic problems, we need direct, actionable solutions. For example, arbitrary quality assessments can be solved by implementing independent third-party grading. To fix that asymmetrical bargaining power, farmers must be encouraged to form farmers-producer organizations, or FPOs. That gives them collective bargaining power so they aren't just isolated individuals. And for lengthy legal disputes, we need fast-track agricultural tribunals for inexpensive, time-bound dispute resolution. We also need some broader essential protections built right into the system. Governments need to mandate standardized, plain-language contracts so farmers actually understand what they're signing. We need strict competition regulations to prevent those monopsonies from forming in the first place. Production risks from climate events have to be mitigated through mandatory crop insurance. And finally, environmental sustainability mandates absolutely must be built directly into the contracts, ensuring that long-term agricultural productivity isn't sacrificed for short-term commercial gains. Which leaves us with this final massive thought. How can institutions ensure commercial efficiency is achieved without compromising equity and the long-term welfare of farming communities? This is quite literally the central policy challenge of our time regarding global food systems. It's not about banning corporate participation in agriculture, but about creating robust frameworks where mutual benefit is actually realized. So next time you're wandering down that grocery store aisle, just remember the invisible strings attached to the food on your table. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.